270 such webinars since we started just around COVID. We have been also very fortunate to host 5 Nobel laureates. Next week, on 18th, we are again hosting another Nobel laureate. Also happy to share that under the G20 India presidency, we have done about 21 webinars on the new international economic order, climate, and women empowerment. India is performing extraordinarily well. There have been global challenges. The very purpose of these webinar series is to discuss contemporary economic issues, both relevant for India and even global. We have seen the tariff wars. We have dedicated 2 webinars totally on the tariff wars and globalization. One from the professor from Brown University, Professor Sebnam, and the other, Professor Mark from University of California, San Diego. Given that despite the global challenges, every indicator of growth that is emerging is showing India to be doing reasonably well, holding on to its position, and the fastest growing large economy of the world. In the midst of all this, we saw that the IMF has given their annual assessment under the Article 4. And therefore, because we thought it's very relevant, and given the situation that's emerging in and around India, India being the only country in the world planning to do a great growth miracle in the next 25 years, catapulting from where it is today, $2,500 per capita income, to at least 17,000 US dollars per capita income to enter the category of advanced countries. Not only the union government, the state governments are also gearing up and engaging different consultants and different strategies to also multiply their per capita income. In this situation, the Article 4 consultation, and this is an excellent report which IMF has come out with, we requested Dr. Ranil Salgado to please come and share the findings of Article 4 with us on this forum. We are very fortunate that he was able to assemble a team from IMF in Washington to speak to us. Let me now introduce you the chair of the session today, Dr. Ranil Salgado, a dual national of the US and Sri Lanka, became the IMF resident representative based in Delhi in March 2024. He's been here for nearly a year, a dear friend, knows the country well. He's been in the IMF for over 27 years and is an assistant director in the IMF's Asia and Pacific department. Prior to his appointment on India as resident rep, India and Bhutan, he was mostly the IMF's mission chief to Japan and supervised work on Timor-Leste and Tonga. He co-edited the book South Asia's Path to Resilient Growth that was published in 2023. Amongst his previous roles in APD, he served as a mission chief to India 2017 to 20, the Marshall Islands, Myanmar and Nepal, as well as the chief of the Regional Studies Division and the IMF resident representative in Singapore from 2005 to 2008. He knows the region very well. He also supervised work on Bhutan, the Maldives, Micronesia. His time at the IMF includes work in the Western Hemisphere also, research and strategy, policy and review departments. Prior to joining the IMF, he worked in a strategic management consulting firm and as teaching and research assistant at the University of Pennsylvania, Johns Hopkins University, and the Federal Reserve Board of Governors. He attended the University of Pennsylvania, Master's and PhD, along with Harvard University undergraduate and Cambridge University. The two speakers for the day are Nujin, and I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing it correct, Ranil. Please correct me when you will be chairing the session. Nujin is a senior economist covering monetary policy and financial sectors for India in the APD, IMF. Prior, she was the desk economist on Austria, Bulgaria, Cambodia, the Euro area, Fiji, and the Iceland. She also worked at the SPR department, Strategy, Policy and Review. She holds a PhD in economics from Duke University. Cristian is the economist, the other speaker today in the IMF's APD. He worked in the IMF's Fiscal Affairs Department, serving as fiscal economist for Honduras and Egypt. He is currently working on issues pertaining to consumption, income, and gender inequality, labor markets, and fiscal policy. He holds a PhD in economics from Princeton University. With this brief introduction about what EGROW does, the chair and the two speakers, I hand over the session to Dr. Ranil to please take the proceedings further. Thank you, Dr. Ranil.
Thank you, Charan, and thank you for that introduction. And good evening to everyone in Delhi and my colleagues who I should say are in the Western Hemisphere. I think Nujin's in Washington and Cristian may be in Argentina. I'm not going to say too much here because already Charan gave the introductions. All I say is he kind of magnified my role on this. The work was done by Nujin, Cristian, along with the others on the India team, including the current mission chief, Harold Finger. My role was relatively minor in the entire process. So anyway, I have the pleasure to moderate this session and to also semi-introduce my colleagues. And I'll actually try to pronounce Nujin's name. So I think, Nujin, will you go first or Cristian?
Cristian will go first, Ranil.
Cristian will go first. So
Yeah.
first I'll hand over to
This.
Cristian, Alonso, and then Nujin, Suphaphiphat will come in later. After the presentation, we'll have a discussion and Q&A. So let me hand over to Cristian.
Thank you very much. Good evening to everyone in Delhi. It's a pleasure to join you today. So thank you so much for having us. I will share some screens. I will share some slides momentarily. Can you see them well? Yep, perfect. So we're very happy to share with you the findings of our Article 4 consultation. This was an exercise that included a mission where we visited India last year in December, and then we published our report after the board discussed it in February this year. So some aspects of it reflect the reality as of February, but then there are a number of issues that are more structural and so long-lasting and so more stable, let's say. And so the key findings of our analysis is that indeed the situation in India, the outlook in India remains fairly positive. The economy has been doing very well, growing strongly, which reflects landmark reforms that were conducted in recent years, difficult reforms that have laid the foundations for macro stability. We are thinking, for instance, the introduction of the GST, the implementation of the inflation targeting by the RBI. And so all those structural reforms that have been conducted over the years have contributed to India now having macroeconomic stability, a strong growth, inflation very much under control, and a fiscal position that is doing well and improving. There was, from a shorter term horizon, there was a little bit of a weaker economic performance in the second quarter of the fiscal year. Last year, that was induced by some slowdown in government expenditure because of the elections, which is natural because the new government was coming into place, and so execution of the budget was a little bit behind. And then there were some other one-off factors, the fact that were excessive rains in August, that drove down a little bit growth in the second quarter of the fiscal year. But since then, we see it improving significantly, recovering, back to the strong levels that we were seeing before, around 6.5%. But as we were discussing before, indeed the world is very uncertain these days, and so it's important for the policy makers to remain nimble and adjust to this uncertain world. And so on the side of fiscal aspects, fiscal buffers should continue to be rebuilt, continuing consolidation at a gradual pace, to make sure that when the next shock hits, we have enough space to adjust. We see that with inflation coming down, there is potentially room for easing monetary policy on the months ahead, as inflation is already, the hard work has already been done and inflation is coming down. And then there are some small pockets of vulnerability in the financial sector that also is important to advance. But perhaps the most important aspect of reforms that we see is the need to advance some of the most challenging factor and product market reforms to unlock potential and to make sure that we have faster growth in investment and a stronger creation in quality jobs. Here we put the emphasis in particular in the issue of quality of jobs, because India's demographic dividend required it to create a lot of good jobs for a growing population. And so the importance of working hard on those structural reforms to make sure that we get those good jobs created. So that's, in a nutshell, our analysis. Let me go a little bit into the specifics. Our analysis of the economy is that the economy is doing well, has rebounded. We're expecting the second quarter of the fiscal year, which is the third quarter of the calendar year that we showed there, to experience only a temporary slowdown. So the recovery, already we saw it in the fourth quarter, a faster growth across different industries. We see, encouragingly, the improvement in private consumption, particularly supported by rural demand that has had a better year this year compared to the past. We see that sustained in high frequency indicators in recent months as well. So private consumption continues to be the main driver of domestic demand. Corporate investment, on the other hand, has been a little bit less dynamic than expected, has been growing a little bit below real GDP growth. And then on the inflation side, overall inflation dynamics have become benign, in the sense that core inflation has been relatively under control, low, perhaps increasing a little bit in recent months, mostly driven by gold and silver prices, but mostly well behaved. Food prices have finally started to come down, but we take into account that we acknowledge that vegetable price volatility remains very significant, and so it is likely that we will continue to be seeing big swings in prices for vegetables, tomato, onions, and potatoes. But the more persistent price shocks, like those that affect cereals, rice, wheat, those are and pulses, those are much more under control after more successful harvests these past year, these two seasons. We also note a significant improvement in headline employment indicators as measured by the PLFS. And so we do note that labor force participation is increasing and employment rates are increasing. However, the quality of jobs still needs additional work. Most of those increases in headline indicators reflect really increases in self-employment or unpaid family workers, which are not the kind of jobs that we'd like to see over the long term. We would like stronger growth on regular employment, ensuring that people have good jobs with benefits and so on. On the financial conditions, they remain broadly accommodative, although in recent months there has been some tightening. So our outlook is fairly positive. These numbers are as we reported in our staff report in February. Now with everything that has happened in terms of tariff announcements and changes in the global scenario, we are revising our numbers ahead of our next WIO publication, which is going to be in a few weeks. But as of February, our view was that India was going to be growing at 6.5% for the next 2 years, with inflation broadly under control, converging to the target of the RBI around 4%. On the external front, the current account deficit remains narrow, so it's pretty much very manageable considering the inflows that India has on FDI and other sources. And general government fiscal consolidation continues to move ahead. That is, we consider that is an important aspect of ensuring macro stability over the long term. But certainly there are risks, and so there are significant risks on the external front, deepening geoeconomic fragmentation in the form of increased protectionism, higher tariffs, constraints to trade. We see those as significant negative risks. Even if India is not a very open economy in terms of imports to GDP compared to other peers in the region, still the magnitude of the shocks that are ongoing in the world definitely would affect even a country that is relatively less exposed. At the same time, intensification of regional conflicts is also a significant risk, thinking about Ukraine and the Middle East, which can lead to challenges to trade, increasing volatility of oil prices, which India remains a significant importer of oil. And the third shock is indeed commodity price volatility, which also is reflecting particularly oil and cereals, wheat and rice. On the domestic front, the main risks that were identified related to weaker investment and private consumption. I think we saw that when public investment was not able to pick up at enough pace in the third quarter, we saw a decline in economic activity, and so that highlights how significant, how important the public investment is. And then, as we were mentioning, the challenge of getting corporate investment up as well, picking up, and ensuring that private consumption continues to recover on the rural front mostly. On the urban front, there was some decline, but the expectation of a stabilization underlines our baseline. Another very significant risk for India domestically is related to climate and weather shocks. So our assumptions are assuming a normal monsoon for the next season, but as we know, abnormal monsoon, whether it is too little rain or too untimely, could be negative for agriculture, and so be damaging to the private consumption recovery. And then on the upside, if there was a stronger than expected implementation of structural reforms, we could expect faster growth and more job creation. So those are the risks to the outline. Let me stop now and pass it on to Nujin for discussion of our policy advice. Thank you.
Thank you, Cristian. So this the policy advice is based on the outlook and risk that we assessed during the February edition, right? So just keep in mind that things may have changed a little bit after the recent global developments. So on fiscal policy, so during that time in February, we were pleased to see the 2025, 25, and 26 budget that envisaged the continued fiscal consolidation. That said, though, the budget also unveiled an increase in personal income tax, where the personal income tax-free threshold has been raised. So while the PIT reduction may bring additional consumption in the middle class, as you know, the goal that the budget has announced, but it comes at the expense of cutting spending elsewhere, including the spending on growth-enhancing expenditures, such as capital expenditure. So going forward, we think that India should continue to tighten the fiscal policy in order to build fiscal buffers and reduce debt service burden, which the interest payments right now is stood at 30% of tax revenue, which is quite high. So with fiscal consolidation, that could be there will be space to free up for other growth enhancing expenditure. So how should India consolidate? Given that the country still has a lot of developmental needs, so we recommend revenue-based reform with a focus on growth-enhancing expenditure. Based on our analysis, India also has room to increase tax revenue by about 4 percentage points of GDP. So revenue-enhancing measures to get somewhat closer to the potential could include, first one is GST simplification, so partially undoing the past decline in the effective rate of GST. The second one is the reversing fuel excise cuts, because during COVID there was a cut on the excise, and then once the global commodity or oil prices came down, so that has not been reversed. So we recommend to reverse that. And then we can also, over time, we can look at, broadening the personal income tax base. These are the revenue measures that we recommend the government to do over the medium term. On the expenditure side, while this budget envisages, a strong spending discipline, there's room to rationalize current expenditure furthermore. That is including by, streamlining subsidies and to make sure that it become more targeted. So in our annual report, which we call the Article 4 report, we presented reform scenarios taking into account of those measures, the revenue measures, as well as the cutting current expenditure. And we assume that the revenue that we raise based on the reform that the government is undertaking and the current expenditure declining, it will create rooms to spend more on the priority areas, including health, social safety nets, and infrastructures. And the analysis incorporated those measures and then assess the analysis on growth and in the medium term and short term. So basically, of course, once we recommend the consolidation, there will be a short-term output cost. But then given that our recommendation also recommend for you to increase health, social safety net, and infrastructure. The short-term output cost is quite low, but in the medium term, that would raise potential growth in the medium term. That's for the fiscal policy. On monetary policy, next slide. Yeah. So for monetary policy, so we think that the RBI is doing a good job at mitigating inflationary pressure, thanks to the effective flexible inflation targeting framework that has been in place since 2015, 2016. So given that, based on our projection, inflation has been gradually declining, we support the RBI's policy rate cut in February, as well as the April one. And we believe that there will be some opportunities for the RBI to lower the policy rate gradually further. But of course, the pace, how much the RBI should reduce, and the timing of the adjustment would depend on the incoming economic data, including the growth outlook as well as inflation outlook. The RBI should also carefully communicate their policy decision as well. Next, on the financial sector, on exchange rate policy. So we noticed that the rupee USD exchange rate has moderately depreciated since November 2024, and that reflects, in part, a strategic shift in the portfolio equity investors, as well as the reassessment of the US monetary policy outlook. So during the same period, during the October to December of last year, we also noticed that the RBI has intervened in the foreign exchange market quite significantly, around $100 billion in that quarter alone. So while we assess that the FX reserves remains adequate, we think that it might not be the best use of reserve, and incomplete sterilization has tightened banking system liquidity, in which the RBI has responded quite nimbly on that. So given India's relatively low foreign exchange mismatch, and the RBI has done a very good job at anchoring inflation expectations, as well as generally India's FX market is quite deep, which means there's a lot of turnovers in the FX turnovers. So India should operate with significantly greater exchange rate flexibility. So because the greater exchange rate flexibility would help foster FX market development even more, and it also can prevent moral hazard by firms by encouraging firms to actively manage their currency risk through hedging, as well as reduce fluctuation in domestic financial system liquidity. Next slide, please. Now we're coming to the financial sector policy recommendation. So this year is quite special because we have another report accompanying our usual report, where it took a very deep dive into the financial sector in India. So we call that report the Financial Stability Assessment Program, or the FSAP. So, so I will explain that later on once we look at the analytical highlight. But based on the FSAP findings, it shows that India's financial sector health has been resilient, with a multi-year low NPL, with adequate capital buffers, as well as comfortable liquidity coverage ratios. So that said, though, the FSAP points out some pockets of vulnerability that should be addressed. For example, one of the vulnerability is that there are concentration risks among some government-owned NBFC, especially to the power sector. So basically, some of the state-owned NBFCs, the big one, they only lend money to the power sector, and that creates concentration risk. This issue partly reflects that the government-owned NBFCs are exempt from concentration limits. So our recommendation is to narrow the regulatory gap between private and government-owned financial institutions. The second vulnerability, which may have kind of dissipated a little bit, is we see on the unsecured personal lending, which was surged for, I think, for the past 2 years. It has now moderated. But what we see now is that delinquencies have risen somewhat, right? Particularly among the small loans. So our recommendation is to ensure that financial institutions maintain strong lending standards and risk management to ensure sustainable credit growth. And that could include broadening the use of targeted macroprudential measures, such as applying debt service to income limits to all household loans that would enhance policy effectiveness. The FSAP also did the stress tests on a couple of financial institutions, banks and BFC, and it underscores the resilience of the financial sectors to macroeconomic stress. But some banks, especially public sector banks, may need to build more capital to be able to continue to provide moderate credit growth during future downturn. And in general, we recommend that banks to start building a releasable counter-cyclical capital buffer before the next credit cycle. The FSAP also look at regulations and supervisions, and here the FSAP also recommends setting the financial stability as main objective in relevant legislation. So for India, it's not clear because they might have, it's fine for a country to have multiple objectives in conducting financial policy, right? For example, some country would have some. For India, we have financial stability or development objective. Our recommend is, in line with international standards, financial stability should be the main objective in this case. Second one, this is a long-standing issue. The FSAP recommend that the regulators' independence and power should be safeguarded to be in line with international standards, especially when it comes to corporate governance of state-owned financial institutions. And for banks, it should, again, to get in line with the international standards, one of the key important things that bank can do is to expedite the adoption of IFRS 9, including adopting of the expected credit loss framework. Now let me go to the structure of policy. Next slide. So India's ambition to become an advanced economy requires a significant, sustained rise in potential growth. So that could be done through holistic horizontal reforms in order to stimulate private investment, create quality jobs, as well as in order to raise potential growth. So here in the chart, we show that how far India's structural policy is far away from the best performers. And the best performer here, we have EM best performer and global performer. So based on the chart, we still see that India has room to catch up to frontier EM as well as global benchmarks among a number of structural reforms. For example, in judiciary, in credit market, in terms of tariff, in trade and tariff and non-tariff barriers. So let me discuss the policy recommendations in more details in the next slide. So in this figure, we aim to provide an overview of reform priorities that the government can undertake. It is differentiated by, on the horizontal axis, you can see the time horizon of the anticipated reform payoff. So the shorter time is, and then from the short term to the medium term. And on the vertical axis, you see that we are categorized based on the responsibility of the government. So we have union government as the main reforming agent, or in a joint responsibility with state governments. So our near-term priorities should include implementation of the labor codes, deepening economic integration, including reduction of trade restrictions, and reforms to attract FDI. And in the budget, we already saw, a comprehensive reduction of tariffs, as well as tariff simplification, which is very welcome. We also think that a continued public investment push and higher R&D spending would be important to raise potential growth for India, as well as to provide foundation for private sectors to come in to invest. Streamlining of business regulations would be very important to create investment-friendly climate for private sectors to come in. Finally, providing strong policy frameworks to foster a stable environment for firms and households. It is very important, especially in the world of heightened uncertainties. So for other priorities, it includes pursuing agricultural, land, governance, and judicial reforms, strengthening education, skilling, public health, and social safety nets. So in our report, we have the structural reform gap analysis, where we quantify the impact of reform that may have on private investment. And Cristian will provide more details on the analysis later on. But now let me next slide, please. So that is overview of our recommendation on fiscal policy, monetary policy, exchange rate policy, and financial policy and structural reform policies. And here, so how do we come up with those recommendations, right? We would have the analytical work underpinning those granular recommendations. And let me highlight a few of them for you. So first, let's talk about the FSAP. I mentioned early on that this year it was quite special because we have a team of experts coming to India and take a very deep dive at the India's financial sectors. So usually the FSAP will take place around every 5 years. And for India, the last one occurred last year. Before that, it was in about 2017, 2018. So the FSAP comprises a team of several financial sector experts to come and take a look at various topics within the financial sector. So the topic that FSAP generally cover for each countries varies. So it depends on what's important for that country. For example, for India, we look at the issue of interconnectedness among banks and BFC as well as mutual fund quite closely, because that we kind of identify those as systemic. So for India, the FSAP report is divided into 3 parts. So the first one is about risk analysis. So basically it includes stress testing, how resilient the financial institutions are for India. So here, stress tests we did for bank and BFC, mutual fund, as well as the system-wide liquidity, which is combining how banks connected to NBFC and mutual fund. We also did the climate stress test as well. For the second part, we look at oversight, which means that we look at regulations and supervision of the bank. So of banks, of NBFC, as well as insurance sector as well. So the topics also cover cyber risks, macroprudential policies, as well as AML CFT. And finally, the last pillar, we talked about crisis management framework, where the FSAP look at the resolution framework and emergency liquidity assistance, etc. So the report is available for download as well at the IMF website. It is accompanying the article for the report that we are presenting right now. Back to Cristian.
Thank you very much, Nujin. And yes, now I will cover the other two analytical chapters that we wanted to very briefly mention to you this evening. One was looking into how to reignite private investment in India. And this starts from the point of view that India's private investment is not low compared to other peers. It's already pretty high at over 20% of GDP. So in that sense, we can see in the first chart in the left-hand side that it is higher than peers, whether it is emerging market economies or G20 EMs. However, India does need to increase its level of investment significantly or increases the stock of capital significantly in order to achieve its goal of becoming an advanced economy by 2047. So even if India's level of investment, private investment at the moment is relatively high, there is a significant gap in the stock of investment stock of capital per capita that requires additional investment efforts. And on the right-hand side, this chart you may be familiar with, that private investment had indeed increased significantly, but in recent years has been a little bit more anemic, more stable. And when we look into the decomposition of private investment, particularly corporate investment and corporate investment in machinery and equipment, is the one that has been relatively anemic. And that is an important component of investment because those are the machines that are going to increase the level of production of the economy over the future. So it requires a particular focus. In recent years, that investment has been doing a little bit better, has depended a lot on housing as opposed to private corporate investment in machinery and equipment. But we also acknowledge that we live in a very uncertain world. And we show in an analytical analysis that economic uncertainty can be a drag on investment projects. It can delay projects. It can lead to less completion of projects getting stalled, projects being terminated. And on the other hand, when we have lower uncertainty, we have a higher number of projects coming up. That emphasizes the importance of providing providing agents, households and firms with a stable policy framework so that they have some certainty in a context that is highly uncertain around the world. We also show that take advantage of the heterogeneity in the development of implementation of structural reforms across states within India. And we find that states that have been more active on structural reforms, easing the business cycle, reducing restrictions, have been more successful at boosting manufacturing investment at the state level. And finally, our analysis also tries to quantify how much would India gain out of implementing some structural reforms. We do this with a cross-country analysis, estimating how other countries have benefited from implementing similar reforms in the past. And that is the chart that we see in the southeast of the panel, the medium-term gain of different reforms, business regulations, judiciary, credit market, if they were to narrow the gap with respect to the benchmark, with respect to peers. We have all these and a lot of more details in the annex of our staff report. And then in the interest of time, let me pass on to the final one, where we looked at labor, the other very significant, very important factor of production for India. And despite India having a very large labor force, a very large population, so potentially this is the most abundant of India's resources, it has not been so much of a driver of growth over the long term. You see in the chart in the northwest, that the red bar and the pink bar that is the contribution of labor and human capital to growth, has been relatively muted compared to the contribution of investment and TFP. Here we look at the payoffs to formal education. We estimate means or regressions using the PLFS microdata, and we find that still in India there are very significant gains from formal education, the magnitude of 6 to 7% per additional year of studying. And we also take advantage of the PLFS to estimate the payoffs to training, the returns to formal training. And we see that indeed formal training has significant payoffs. We see that formal training has especially high payoffs to relatively low skilled workers. We see that formal training for workers with less than primary education can boost their profits by some over 20%. And also very important for workers with secondary education, whereas learning on the job is especially important for workers with tertiary education. Also using cross-country regressions, we find that reducing the labor market gap, this is in reforming labor market institutions to make them more flexible and more in line with global benchmarks. So reducing the gap by 25% relative to a frontier EM could create some 44 million jobs within 5 years. So this goes to the point that the importance of moving forward with labor reforms to make sure that they are inclusive and provide more flexibility in the labor market while also protecting the rights of workers, trying to strike the right balance between the two important policy priorities. And finally, also very important for human capital, while wasting and stunting have declined since over the last 2 decades, they remain relatively high, and so interventions, public sector interventions to try to continue to drive those lower remains very, very important. Our analytical work also includes all these other papers, annexes and short pieces of research that are all available in our report. So to summarize, we have a very positive view of the Indian economy. We think that the economy is performing well and has the policy mix, while some tweaks may be necessary at the macro level, overall it has been prudent, and that has allowed this robust growth. At the same time, it's an important time to move forward with the structural reforms to make sure that the potential growth is unlocked, and so good jobs, quality jobs can be created for India's growing population. Thank you very much. Let me stop there, and we're happy to take any questions.
So thank you, Cristian and Nujin. So as they mentioned, welcome questions and a discussion. Either signal, I see Charan has a question maybe, or also you can put it to signal to me that you'd like to speak in the chat or raise your hand. So anyway, over to Charan.
Thank you very much. I think both the presentations were fantastic. And I want to thank Nujin for bringing in FSAP, because when I read the FSAP, and I felt very good. I myself was at the RBI for many years and then at the IMF at the IEO. So I know the high quality work you people do and the amount of effort you put in. So the FSAP was beautiful, and I'm so happy that you weaved it in. Thank you for doing that. Okay, now I have 2 questions, and if you're not comfortable, absolutely no problems. But I wanted to know from Cristian, we in India believe that we have the potential to grow higher than 6.5%. And we also feel that the global uncertainties, or put it like this, the headwinds we will face in exports because of the global uncertainties that you are seeing now could restrict us to 6.5%. Otherwise, our potential is anywhere between 7.5 to 8. I'd like to have your observations because as a international multilateral institutions, and I know the type of GEM models that you do, and Douglas Laxton's models are so precise. So what would be your thought on the potential and what we can do to reach that? Nujin, your presentation was excellent and you did the recommendations and you also told us what all we could do. Now, given the global uncertainties that we are facing, would you, and is there a thought in the IMF that there can be a pause button or a mild relaxation of inflation targeting regime? There could be little tolerance or flexibility so that the countries which are going to suffer from the headwinds, global headwinds, have some leeway, and the fiscal indicators. Any accommodative tolerance band for a short period, sort of a pause button, so that countries are able to revive and recover. I know Cristian is in the fiscal policy department, so maybe, but I thought Nujin, because you are senior also and you brought in the FSAP, so I'm posing this question to you on IT and the fiscal Maastricht, because you imposed the Maastricht Treaty on all of us. And the countries, advanced countries, have also not been following it after the global financial crisis. So your views, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Charan. Maybe we'll have your questions answered first, because at the moment I don't see any other. So first, Cristian on potential, and then Nujin on both monetary and fiscal policy. So over to Cristian.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you so much for those questions. Indeed, very good points. So on potential, our estimate is that with current policies, we are estimating a potential of 6.5 at present, but we definitely think that India has a potential to grow much faster. But we do think that it's important to push through some of the important reforms. There we're thinking about implementation of the labor codes to make sure that the labor force is more flexible, advancing land and agricultural reforms to make sure that we have a reallocation of resources toward the most productive uses, like people moving to more out of agriculture. We still have 45% of people in agriculture. Moving them into services and into industry can help make them much more productive and get better jobs. We still think, even in this context of uncertainty, global uncertainty, we still think that opening up to trade could have a lot of potential for India in terms of reallocation, in terms of being able to export to the world what India can produce. Even if the vast majority of growth in India, we think that will be driven by domestic demand, we think that the opening up to trade would raise productivity. And so definitely, if some of those reforms were to be implemented, we definitely believe that India can grow much faster than 6.5%. On that, yeah, we agree. Let me pass on to Nujin for the second question. Thank you.
So on inflation, so I think the first and foremost, right, monetary policy should be the first line of defense to focus on the needs of the domestic economy. And for India, I think based on the RBI mandate, the objective is to achieve price stability, which is a very important framework to ensure there will be private investment and fostering foreign direct investment. And the good thing about India is that you have flexible inflation targeting framework where there's a band, right, 2 to 6, where it can accommodate a lot of domestic shocks within the economy. So we think that monetary policy can work well, and then to foster price stability. So now when the shock come, in the heightened uncertainties. Fiscal policy would be a very good tool to use, right? So that's why in our long-standing recommendation, we recommend India to, build fiscal buffers in order to mitigate the impact of those shocks, right? So, for example, during COVID, shock hits, right? And it's both demand and supply shocks. So here our recommendation is just to use the fiscal buffer space that you have already, accumulated. Use that in order to absorb the adverse impact from those shock, right? Once the shock dissipated, then what you should do is just go back and try to, build up more fiscal buffers. So for India, based on the fiscal space assessment, we do think that India still have some fiscal space. And if the shock happened, through deceleration of, a strong deceleration of domestic demand, or from external or domestic shock, then fiscal policy would be a very good tool to use. But again, the devil is in the detail, right? Our long-standing recommendation is if you decided to do the fiscal stimulus, it should be very targeted to affected sectors. Thank you.
Thanks, Cristian and Nujin. At the moment, I don't see any. Okay, there are some people who are posting in the chat. Would you like to speak out, or should I just read the question? So let me read the question. What would be the possible challenges for the Indian economy with the reflection of tariff increase by the US, as well as the trade war? So who would like to take that on?
I can take that one.
Cristian. Yeah, you go ahead.
I can take a first step. That is a very timely question. It's indeed very, very important. So, as I mentioned before, India is relatively not super exposed as other countries in the region, but still exports one of the main trading partners is the US. Some 2.5, 2.7% of GDP in Indian exports go to the US. So it is not a minor number. The tariffs announced by the American administration, even if there are some sectors that are not affected, there are some exemptions and so on, they have the potential to be quite disruptive in certain sectors. Still, it would not be as massive as in other countries that have a higher level of exposure, but it could have a negative impact. We are not done with our calculations yet. We are still refining our numbers, and the reality is changing day after day. But we do think that it can be a drag to some extent on growth. And then the other aspect of this is not just the direct effect that can be negative, but also if we have lower growth overall in the world, that global demand can also be detrimental to India's growth in exports to other countries. So this, in general, we tend to advocate for free trade, so that countries can take advantage of trade and benefit from that in their economies. So these dynamics, we don't think they would be favorable for any country. But well, the recommendation from our point of view, the recommendation still stands to continue making efforts to expand India's trade network. And we see the Indian authorities are indeed discussing a number of free trade agreements with a number of partners to potentially open up new markets so that Indian firms can have more markets to export to. Let me stop there. Thank you.
So there appears to be two other questions that have come up in the chat. One is somewhat linked to what you were just discussing, Cristian. So let's go with that. It's also next in order. What would be the effect of global uncertainty on the consumption pattern in India?
Yes. So I think empirically we have tended to find that uncertainty is a drag on investment, private investment. So that would be the first channel, but then also on consumption goods that are kind of similar to investments. So in that sense, I think potentially more vulnerable to higher uncertainty are the consumption of durables. So those things that you think carefully about buying because it's gonna take some time. Perhaps you need to go into credit to buy a new TV or a new appliance. And there you have more uncertainty. And then if you are not gonna have a job next year, or there's more sources of uncertainty about your factory or your place of work, then you may hold back on those goods. So we would consider perhaps those are the consumption items that could be most vulnerable. The level of consumption when it comes to necessities or things that food, those things, I think those are fairly stable and may not be so much affected by uncertainty beyond the effect of lower growth. But what is discretional is those are areas that potentially could be hurt. At this point, given the magnitude of the shock, I think we're mostly concerned about the investment channel, though, the private investment channel as a starting point for India, but definitely could spill over onto private consumption. Thank you.
Thanks, Cristian. Before we go on to the question on GVA, there's also a long kind of question on the WTO. We'll get back to that later. But just to comment originally on Nujin's answer to Charan on the role of potential role of monetary and fiscal policy in the context of these global shocks. As Cristian said, things are changing daily. But it is more likely, I think, at least I personally think, that this is a demand shock for India as opposed to a supply shock. There'll be a supply shock elements. To the extent it is a demand shock, that gives even more freedom for monetary policy to adjust, consistent with inflation targeting, right? So I think the first part of Nugent's answer exactly fits that. Most likely this is a demand shock, and therefore there'll be scope for monetary policy to respond. And then, as she said, fiscal policy, depending on the size of the shock, can respond, particularly in a targeted and temporary manner. Let me maybe move on to this question on GVA while other questions are coming in. So the question on GVA is, why does high GVA growth in India not translate into proportional employment growth? I think that's a question also for Cristian.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's a very good question. Why we haven't had that growth creation? And I think in order to have employment growth and good employment to grow, we definitely need more progress on human capital accumulation, human capital policies, and then some revision of some of the labor market institutions. On labor market policies, as we discussed, there are very high payoffs to formal education, 6 to 7% higher wages if you complete one more year of education. So they are very significant payoffs. And we do see that young kids, the level of enrollment has been going up a lot. The level of completing primary and secondary education has also increased a lot. But there's still a big chunk of the population, a big share of the population that does not have such level of education completed. A significant part of the population, particularly in rural areas, lacks that education, which prevents them from moving on to more productive sectors. At the same time, health outcomes, while there has been some progress over the last 2 decades, there's still more to be done. So making sure that workers are productive through these very hard, very slow labor reforms, it's an important priority to make sure that we have faster employment growth of better quality. And at the same time, for some sectors, there may be too many constraints for job creation, particularly for manufacturing, when we think about the regulations in the Industries Act and so on. And so moving forward with implementation of the labor codes, which we're trying to strike the right balance between flexibilizing labor markets while protecting workers' rights. We think it's an important move forward to make sure that there's potential of more jobs to be created, good jobs to be created. Thank you.
So maybe I'll just comment on the question related to the WTO. Unfortunately, the WTO right now, I don't think has a lot of power in terms of this, the current trade issues, and that's unfortunate. The WTO process would lead to kind of a dispute resolution process, but that has been weakened in recent years. So unfortunately, the WTO's ability to respond to all these, and essentially countries adjusting tariffs above what they had promised. Typically you have, I forgot what the term is, upper ceiling, and countries can lower below it. So for example, India's ceilings are higher than its actual tariffs. So India can adjust its tariffs up and down a little bit within that context. In the current context, of course, countries are raising tariffs above their tariff ceilings, which is unfortunate. But essentially, yeah, there you go. Someone wrote bound, Chris wrote bound versus applied tariffs, the bound tariffs versus the applied tariffs, which is currently what's unfortunate is that countries are raising the US in particular is raising tariffs above the bound rates. Maybe we'll go on to a couple of questions related to interest rates, and maybe these could be directed at Nujin. So one is, how do rising US bond rates impact the Indian economy? And two, what would be the impact of reducing interest rates on bank deposits when credit deposit ratios are already high?
Thank you for the questions. So for the U.S. bond rates, rising U.S. bond rates, so that could have, of course, implication on capital flows, right? So we have seen, the rising U.S. bond rates during, for example, in November, then we see a portfolio outflow from India. So, and that, have implications on exchange rate and others. But then one good thing about India is that when the JPM bond inclusion, that kind of, induced capital inflow as well, right? So on level, basically we see that, that's a good development to bring in portfolio flows to the India economy. So that's kind of the impact has been kind of mitigated, right? And in the long term, so what's important is actually the fundamentals of the economy itself. So that's why, as long as India is, still growing quite strongly, I think the impact should be relatively manageable compared to other countries. On the credit deposit ratios, we see some rising, credit deposit ratios for India, right? And at the very beginning, we were debating whether it could be an issue. But then, if we look at, historically, yes, it has been rising. But if we compare India's credit deposit ratios to other countries, it's still quite low. And the RBI has been quite manage the credit deposit ratios quite well. And right now, what we see is the credit growth is actually slowed down a little bit. During those times where the surge in unsecured personal lending has surged, the RBI has introduced the risk weight assets in order to try to mitigate those issues. So I think overall credit growth, so credit of one institution, the deposit of one bank would be, the money circulate around in the financial sector, right? So basically, if we look at the overall, I would not be worried about it too much. So I think we should have look at the details. So where are the surge in the credit sectors has been persistent, and then react on that.
Thanks, Nujin. Another question I guess I should direct to you is on the FRBM thresholds, especially given the current projections are above the earlier 60% debt threshold. So what is the IMF's current view on that? When you look at general government to GDP as
Yeah, so I think on the FRBM, I think the latest budget, right? The government has kind of moved away from the FRBM thresholds and kind of set the central government target of 50 plus minus 1% of GDP. So that's true that so we think that the pace of adjustment of the fiscal policy as I presented early on, that we believe that there should be continued fiscal consolidations, right? But at the pace that will not hurt growth. So that's why in our projection, we kind of lay down the baseline projection of debt to GDP ratio in the medium term. But then we also have recommendations of where the government or India authorities can do in order to bring down public debt to GDP. Of course, we need to consider the developmental needs that India has, right? So that's why in our projection, we have some recommendations on how we can achieve the medium-term debt target.
So there are a couple of questions. Ranil will be joining in a second. There are a couple of questions. I wasn't sure if you would like to tackle those. It's in the chat box. As Indo-Pacific region is concerned with the current importance in current geopolitics and economic strategies, my question to expert, how you see the importance of the region for India, for its growth, and resemblance with the motive to preserve identity in the region against China or any other nation. As the experts are from Asia Pacific experts, how do they see it? Would you like to, any one of you like to respond to that?
Sure, we can perhaps say a few thoughts on this. So in the book that actually Ranil edited, which was for South Asia, there was an analysis on the trade environment within South Asia. And I think compared to other regions, the potential for a stronger growth in trade or stronger trade linkages is there. South Asia at this point is not so integrated. And so there's much room to integrate within the region. We do think that India has potential to grow its trade linkages with a number of partners. There's a complementarity with advanced economies in the sense that they may offer some imports that India does not have, but India has the potential to export things to a number of advanced economies. And so all these efforts that the authorities are conducting in terms to open up new markets in a number of advanced economies in the Euro area, the US, New Zealand. They have already signed an FTA with Australia, or at least a first phase. So there's a number of potential trading partners to develop both advanced economies in other regions, but also within the region there's potential to have stronger ties, so that new markets to open up and the potential to get cheap imports or good, well-priced imports as inputs for the production of some goods and services. So we do see the potential for India to have a stronger trade linkages. Thank you.
So thanks, Cristian.
Oh.
I'm back, John. I lost power there for a few minutes. Some of the fun of being in India. I think that may be all the questions I see, and we're also over time. Charan, is that correct? We're probably over time, right?
Karen, If Chris is around, can Chris ask his question? Chris Garraway?
I think
you
he was
could
trying
mute
to
it.
help me. Chris was trying to help me on when I was explaining the WTO thing.
Okay.
Is that,
I just wanted
is
to
that
mention
correct, Chris?
most favored nation bound tariffs. That's it. No question. Thanks, Sharon. Great presentation, folks. Thank you.
Okay.
From my side, first I'd like to thank Charan for organizing this, EGROW, for organizing this seminar. And then, of course, to Cristian and Nujin. There seems to be one more question from Salma. Oh, or is that a question or applause? Or is there another question before we conclude? No. And to thank Cristian and Nujin for the great presentation and the subsequent discussion, and to all of you for the challenging questions that you posed today. So back to Charan for maybe final comments.
Thank you so much. My founder director of EGROW, Dr. Ashok Vishendas, has also joined, and I was wondering if he has a question. Ranil, if you permit that. Ashok, do you have a question?
Charan, in fact, I am somewhere else, so
Okay.
I could not fully, and I am not in a position to speak
Okay.
more. So but I enjoyed partly. Thank you very much, Professor Charan, and all the panelists. I was listening to them with great attention. I enjoy.
There is a
Thank you.
storm in Delhi and in NCR. So I can understand that people are getting stuck somewhere. That's fine. So I just want to thank Ranil. Thank you for agreeing. And thank you very much for requesting your headquarters, Nujin and Christine, to join us. And as you have seen that we have benefited a lot, but I'm sure both of you at headquarters and Ranil, you as a resident rep, would have also benefited from the questions and the queries we had, so that you know that we are reading your product and we are also thinking about various things and also wondering, quote, worrying how we are going to get impacted by this super uncertain global environment. Ranil has handled that question on WTO very well. But in India, there is a story which says that when two elephants fight, the grass suffers. Of course, India is not grass anymore now, but then certainly the two giants are the giants. And we get a feeling that dialogue is the best way, because through dialogue, at least nobody suffers. So we leave you with that thought at the IMF headquarters and our dear friend Ranil. This is what I would think, that we Indians would prefer. Dialogue is better than confrontation. I would like to make an announcement. This is an excellent bonus presentation today because FSAP got added in. I'm sure many of us are going to listen to it a number of times. I'm certainly going to listen to it tomorrow again. So our recording will be available on our website tomorrow by noon. Feel free to take advantage and then share with others. Next week, we have Professor James Robinson from Chicago, the Nobel laureate, speaking to us on democracy and growth. The time is a little later because he's in Chicago. So we would send you the flyer, and I would request you to please join us and be part of this, this endeavor that we are doing to think together about national and global issues. And democracy and growth is one thought which has come in the mind of many, and I'm sure it has come in the mind of IMF also, that some countries which are not democratic have had a blazing track record of growth, and some countries which have the potential but are democratic are not able to, despite their best effort, are not able to attain that blazing track of growth. So maybe it will be useful for us to participate with Professor Robinson and ask him questions. So I would welcome you next week. So with that, wishing you all a great weekend. We have a long weekend in India. So wishing you all a great weekend and looking forward to seeing you next week. And finally, thanking Dr. Ranil, Nujin, and Cristian for sparing time and being with us today. Thank you to the participants for having enriched the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you.